What you are about to hear changed the life of an artist forever. A woman who lost everything, discovered something money cannot buy, and a commission that seemed simple turned into the greatest challenge of her life. This is the story of Emma Walsh, and the miracle of the Virgin Mary that no one expected. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I would love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. Chicago, spring of 2020. Emma Walsh was 34 years old when her life collapsed for the second time. The first time had been a year and a half earlier in December 2018 when the phone rang at 3 in the morning. The voice on the other end belonged to a hospital nurse, professional but heavy with that trained compassion Emma would soon learn to hate. There had been an accident, a drunk driver, a head-on collision. David was in the emergency room and she needed to come immediately. Emma still remembered every second of that night. The smell of the hospital, disinfectant, mixed with stale coffee and fear, the endless hallway leading to the emergency waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects, and the waiting. That torturous waiting while doctors did what they could on the other side of that door. Emma had prayed that night. Right there, sitting in that chair, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She prayed like she had never prayed before. She begged, she bargained, she promised anything if David survived. But when the doctor finally came out with that look Emma recognized, even before hearing the words, everything fell apart. David didn't make it. In the months that followed, Emma tried to keep going, wake up, breathe, paint, but it was as if her hands had forgotten the way. You know that feeling? When something inside you breaks in a way no one can explain, when you function, but you don't really live? Emma lived like that now. The studio where she worked was in an old building on Chicago's west side. 3 stories of red brick worn down by time. Tall windows that let in that golden late afternoon light, the kind of light David always said was perfect for sculpting. He used to work there with her, side by side. He sculpted, she painted canvases. They talked about art, about life, about dreams that felt so possible back then. Now his space was empty, covered by a white sheet Emma didn't have the courage to remove. Every time she looked at that corner of the studio, she saw him there, smiling at her, making those terrible jokes that always made her roll her eyes and laugh at the same time. That April morning, she was sitting on the studio floor, surrounded by envelopes, an electricity bill with a shut-off notice, rent 3 months overdue. She had sold almost everything that had any value. The television, the leather sofa they had bought together when they got married, even some of his old sculptures, pieces she had sworn she would never sell. And still, it wasn't enough. The phone rang early that morning, before the sun had fully risen. The landlord's voice was direct, without pretense. "Miss Walsh, I need the payment by Monday, or we're going to have another conversation." Another conversation. Such a polite way to say eviction, to say she would be put out on the street with whatever belongings she had left. Emma looked at her hands, hands that had once earned an honorable mention at an exhibition when she was only 22, and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. Now, empty hands. You know that moment when you realize you've hit rock bottom? Emma was there now. She had sent portfolios to galleries. All of them ignored her. Some didn't even bother to send that standard rejection email. And faith? That faith she once had when she prayed before bed, when she genuinely believed there was someone up there taking care of everything? It died along with David. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, halfway through the day, when the phone rang. Emma looked at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, she didn't answer those calls. Unknown numbers meant collectors with rehearsed scripts. More pressure, more reminders that she was failing at absolutely everything. But something made her answer this time. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the desperation for any distraction from the suffocating reality around her. "Hello." Her voice came out weaker than she intended. The voice on the other end was female, soft. It carried a light southern accent that made every word sound gentler, warmer. "Miss Walsh?" Emma hesitated for a second. "Yes, this is her. My name is Catherine Miller. I saw your paintings at an exhibition 2 years ago. I never forgot your work." Emma was genuinely surprised. 2 years ago felt like an entire lifetime, back when the world still made some sense. Thank you." She didn't know what else to say. It had been so long since someone spoke about her work like that, with that tone of admiration. Catherine continued, her voice growing firmer. "I need to commission a painting, Miss Walsh. Something very specific, very important to me and to the community where I live." Emma picked up a pencil and a crumpled piece of paper nearby, ready to write down the details. Any work was welcome at that moment. Any money would help delay the inevitable. "Can you tell me more about what you have in mind?" Catherine took a deep breath on the other end of the line. "I want you to paint Our Lady, the Virgin Mary." The words hung in the air for a moment. Emma felt something tighten in her chest. Not exactly anger, but a visceral resistance, as if her entire body was saying no before her mind could fully process it. The Virgin Mary, the same one she had begged that night in the hospital. Catherine went on, unaware of the turmoil her words had caused. "It's for a small chapel, in a humble place, but one full of history. My family has attended it for generations. I baptized my 4 children there. I got married there on a June morning 32 years ago. I buried my youngest brother there 6 years ago, after he left far too young." Catherine's voice wavered slightly at the last part, carrying the weight of a loss that was old but still present. Emma knew that tone well. It was the same one she heard in her own voice when she spoke about David. "I recently received an inheritance, Miss Walsh. It's not a fortune, but it's significant enough to do something important." Catherine paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "That community deserves something beautiful, something that makes people feel they are not alone when they walk into the chapel broken, that someone sees them, even when they feel invisible to the rest of the world." Emma said nothing, just listened, as she wrote everything down. Catherine continued, "I can offer $45,000 for the piece." The world stopped. $45,000. Emma looked around the studio as if she were seeing everything for the first time. The bills scattered across the floor. That money would save everything, literally everything. It would pay the overdue rent with enough left for the coming months. It would buy time to breathe, to rebuild, to maybe believe there was a possible future. But there was a problem burning deep inside her. How could she, someone who no longer believed in any of it, someone who had turned her back on God, paint something sacred? How could she give life, soul, presence to an image that, to her, represented only broken promises and unanswered prayers? "Miss Walsh, are you still there?" Catherine's voice pulled her back. Emma closed her eyes for a moment. Faith, or the lack of it, wouldn't pay the bills. She was an artist. And artists paint what is asked of them, whether they believe in the subject or not. That was how it worked. "I accept," she finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. On the other end of the line, Catherine let out a sigh of relief that seemed to come from very deep within. "Oh, Miss Walsh, you have no idea how much this means to me, to our entire community. You really have no idea." There was a brief silence, and then Catherine added, her voice growing softer, more intimate. "I want her to look real, you know, not like those cold, distant images we see. I want whoever looks at the painting to feel that she is truly there, present, seeing every wound, every scar, every secret pain we carry. I want it to look like she understands, like she cares." Emma wrote the words down, but they weighed on her, as if they carried a meaning she wasn't ready to understand. After she hung up the phone, she sat in silence for a long time. And in that moment, without knowing exactly why, a shiver ran down her spine. In the days that followed, Emma plunged into research like she never had before. She bought used books on sacred art online, spending money she barely had but considered a necessary investment. She studied for hours at the public library. She observed every detail of famous paintings, but everything felt too distant, too technical, too cold. How had Catherine put it? I want her to look real, like she's truly there. How do you give reality, true presence, to something you consider nothing more than an illusion? How do you paint faith when you have none? She began the sketches on a cloudy Thursday. A blank canvas stretched on the easel, a graphite pencil in her hand. She tried to focus only on technique, to forget everything else. She outlined the face using the classical proportions she had learned in art school. She stepped back to evaluate the result, and she realized immediately it had no life, no soul. It was just lines on white fabric. She tried again, this time focusing on giving more emotion to the face. She erased, redid it, changed the tilt of the head, tried different expressions. Nothing worked. Each version looked worse than the last. By the third day, she simply stopped sleeping altogether, surviving on cold coffee and that visceral fear of failing once again, of losing this last chance to save herself from the financial abyss. Frustration grew inside her, consuming every thought. Why? She asked herself repeatedly, staring at the failed attempts scattered around the studio. Why can't I do this? She had painted hundreds of faces over the years. She knew how to capture emotion, how to translate subtle feelings into brushstrokes and shades of color. She knew how to give depth to the eyes, how to make it seem as though a real human being was looking back through the canvas. But now her hands seemed to have forgotten everything they once knew, and her wrist hurt, that chronic pain that had started months earlier and that doctors had called repetitive strain tendinitis. Use it less, they said. Rest more. But how could she rest when painting was literally the only thing standing between her and living on the street? Every brushstroke came with a sharp stab that traveled up her arm, a constant reminder that even her own body was giving up on her. It was on a Friday night that something began to change in a subtle way. Emma was working on the Virgin Mary's mantle, trying to find the exact shade of blue that would convey serenity and presence at the same time. Long, fluid brushstrokes followed the imagined drape of the fabric, and her wrist screamed with every movement. She stopped, set the brush down on the palette, and massaged the sore area with her left hand, applying that circular pressure that sometimes brought a little relief. That was when she noticed something strange. The pain had diminished. Not disappeared completely, but reduced in a noticeable way. Emma frowned, confused. She picked up the brush again, went back to painting the blue mantle, and the pain diminished even more. She stopped painting. The pain returned almost immediately, sharp and familiar. She started painting again. The pain faded once more. Emma stared at the brush in her hand as if it were a strange and magical object. She looked at the canvas, at the still incomplete blue mantle. She looked at her own hands, turning them in the dim light of the studio. What is happening? She murmured to herself. Coincidence, she decided firmly. It had to be just a coincidence. Maybe the medication she had taken a few hours earlier was finally kicking in. Maybe it was just the different position she was using to hold the brush. But something small inside her, something she was desperately trying to ignore, whispered that it was none of that. On Saturday afternoon, Emma was mixing paints on the palette. She was so focused on the task that she almost didn't notice when it happened. Light. But it wasn't sunlight coming through the window. The day was overcast, cloudy, threatening rain since morning. This light was different, bluish, soft like velvet, almost ethereal. It appeared out of nowhere and illuminated only the canvas, leaving the rest of the studio in the normal gloom of a cloudy afternoon. Emma froze with the brush suspended above the palette. She watched the light for several seconds, her brain trying to process it, trying to find a logical explanation. She walked slowly to the window, looked outside searching for the source. Gray clouds covered the entire sky. She returned to the canvas, her heart now beating faster. The light was still there, bathing the unfinished painting in that impossible bluish glow. It lasted a few minutes, then it disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. Emma stood in the middle of the studio for a long time, breathing fast. Hands trembling slightly, she tried to rationalize it. There had to be an explanation. Something. "This isn't real," she said out loud to the empty studio. But it had been real. She had seen it with her own eyes. And worse still, a small and stubborn part of her, a part she thought she had extinguished along with her faith, was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, something greater was happening there. An entire week passed. Emma barely left the studio, barely ate, and certainly didn't sleep properly. The body of the painting was taking shape now. The blue mantle seemed to have real depth, as if you could slip your hand into it and feel soft fabric. The white garments with delicate folds suggested movement, as though an invisible breeze touched them. The hands were positioned in a gesture of prayer. But the face was still wrong, technically perfect, yes, but empty, without the spark Catherine had asked for, without seeming as though there was someone truly there, looking back. It was on a Sunday close to midnight that Emma was working alone in absolute silence. Outside, the city had that strange stillness that only comes in the early hours of the morning. She was adjusting delicate shadows around the still, incomplete eyes when it happened. Cold. Not the normal cold of a spring night in Chicago, something completely different. A cold that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, that passed through the skin and touched the bones in a way air conditioning or wind never could. Emma stopped painting, set the brush down, looked around the studio with her senses on full alert. All the windows were closed, the heater was on. But the cold kept increasing, growing more intense with every passing second. Emma felt her heart racing in her chest. Her hands were trembling now, not from cold, but from something much deeper, something primitive that comes from the recognition that something impossible is happening. And then came the scent. Roses. Not a vague or distant smell. Intense. Present. Real. As if someone had just entered the studio carrying armfuls of fresh roses picked from a garden. Emma completely abandoned what she had been doing. She slowly turned, searching for the source of the perfume. There were no flowers, anywhere. There was no way the scent could be coming from outside, from some neighboring garden. And yet it was there, filling every inch of the studio, so real and tangible that Emma could almost feel the velvety petals materializing in the air. Emma sat heavily on the studio floor, her back against the cold wall. And for the first time in months, perhaps since the funeral, she allowed herself to truly cry. Not the restrained, silent crying she did alone at night, but deep sobs that came from somewhere in the center of her chest, shaking her entire body. She cried for the loss, for the loneliness. She cried for the faith she had lost, for the anger she carried toward God. The perfume lingered for a few minutes, and then, just as gradually, the scent began to fade, until it disappeared completely. Emma remained sitting there on the floor for another 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to process, trying to find some explanation that made sense in the rational, logical world, but there was no explanation. She finally stood up, legs unsteady, and looked at the unfinished canvas. The Virgin Mary stared back at her with those still, lifeless eyes, waiting to be completed, waiting to receive the spark Catherine had asked for. On Monday morning, Emma called the medical office and scheduled an urgent appointment. She was no longer worried about her wrist, which, strangely enough, didn't hurt when she painted anymore. She was worried about her own sanity. Maybe it was some serious neurological issue, something that made sense in the world of medicine and science. The doctor examined her with professional attention, ordered detailed tests. A week later, she returned to the office to hear the results. The doctor greeted her with a confused expression. "Miss Walsh," he finally said, "we didn't find absolutely anything wrong." Emma blinked. "What do you mean, nothing?" She was sure something would be found. There had to be something. "Your tests are perfect, and about the wrist you mentioned—" He looked again at the results of the hand exams. "There are no signs of tendinitis, no inflammation, no injury." Emma left the doctor's office in a kind of trance. She went to her car in the parking lot, sat behind the wheel, but couldn't make her fingers turn the key in the ignition. She sat there as the afternoon sun warmed the inside of the car, just thinking, processing, the mysteriously healed wrist, the impossible blue light that illuminated only the canvas, the scent of roses with no physical source, and now the medical confirmation that there was nothing wrong with her. So what was it? Emma rested her forehead against the steering wheel, closed her eyes, and for the first time since David left, felt real fear. Not fear of something bad or threatening, but fear of having to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, God had not turned his back on her that night in the hospital. That perhaps the answer wasn't abandonment, but something she still didn't have the capacity to understand. The following weeks were the most intense of Emma's life. She thought of nothing but the painting. She didn't answer the phone when it rang. Nothing else existed beyond the canvas and the brushes, and that urgent need to finish, to discover where this journey was leading. It was on a Wednesday, early June, late at night. Emma was adjusting shadows around the still incomplete eyes when the air changed. It grew dense, heavy. She dropped the brush. The scent of roses filled the studio once again. She looked at the canvas. Emma stepped back, bumped into the table, and then she appeared, the Virgin Mary, not in the painting, but there, real. Emma's legs gave way. She fell to her knees. The face bore an impossible serenity. The garments moved on their own, but it was the eyes, filled with a compassion Emma had never seen. The Virgin Mary did not move her lips, but Emma heard, "I never abandoned you." The sobs came deep. 18 months of pain exploding all at once. I was with you in every tear, in every moment you thought you wouldn't survive. Emma covered her face, crying. It could have been a minute. It could have been an eternity. Emma no longer knew. She only felt. A peace she had never experienced, a love she thought she had lost forever, something that transcended any logic, any reason, any pain she had carried for 18 months. And then, as gently as she arrived, she began to disappear. The blue light dimmed, softened, and disappeared. Emma knelt on the cold floor of the studio, not by choice. She simply couldn't get up. Tears were still running down her face, silent, deep. They were not tears of sadness, nor of joy. They were tears of healing, of something that had been broken and was now beginning to come back together, of a wound that was finally starting to close. Emma stayed there for a length of time she couldn't measure. When she finally stood up, she was exhausted, but different, completely different. She looked at the canvas, and for the first time, she knew exactly how to paint the face. In the days that followed, Emma painted differently. Every brushstroke flowed effortlessly. Every detail fit perfectly. There was no more doubt. Her hands knew the way now. The eyes were painted last. Emma spent hours on them, not because they were technically difficult, but because they were sacred. They were the eyes that had seen her completely. When she finished the final brushstroke and stepped back, Emma had to hold on to the chair. The painting was finished. But it wasn't just a painting. It was something that transcended technique. It seemed alive. The eyes of the Virgin Mary appeared to follow whoever looked at them, not in a frightening way, but in a welcoming one. It had that quality of presence that Catherine had asked for, the feeling that someone was truly there. Emma felt a shiver, one of reverence. Because she knew this hadn't come from her alone. Her hands had done the work, yes, but something greater had guided those hands. And for the first time in 18 months, Emma Walsh felt gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for having been chosen to create something that might touch other broken souls. Emma understood something deep. The apparition hadn't happened just to complete a painting. It had happened to heal her, to remind her of truths she had forgotten in the pain of grief, to show her that she had never been alone, even in the darkest moments when she was absolutely certain that she was. The painting had been the vehicle, but the true work of art was the transformation that happened within her, the broken heart that slowly began to mend, the abandoned faith that found new life, the lost hope that was rediscovered. That was the true miracle. Before we finish, I want to invite you to be part of our prayer community to the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and share graces received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this chain of prayer, click below and become a channel member today and come pray with us. And look, if you made it all the way here to the end of Emma's story and the painting that changed lives, do one thing for me. Write in the comments, blue light, the phenomenon that announced the presence of the Virgin Mary in the studio. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached, and every time I read blue light in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Write in the comments about a miracle you have witnessed or experienced, and share this video with someone who needs renewed hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.